The king of late night wasn't just known for his biting humor. Johnny Carson also carried one of the foulest tongues in Hollywood. He could charm you one moment and cut you down the next. Yet, even with all that fire, millions adored him. When Carson died in 2005, the world expected his funeral to be packed with friends, rivals, and Hollywood's biggest names paying their last respects. But shockingly, there was one person who flat out refused to show up. A decision so bold, it raised eyebrows and kept people talking long after the service ended. So who was the one person that turned their back on Carson's final goodbye? And why? Stick around, because this story might just change the way you see the king of late night forever. Joan Rivers. Johnny Carson died in 2005 from emphysema, and while his burial gathered co-workers, friends, and even a few rivals, not everyone was there. One notable absence was Joan Rivers. To understand why she skipped his funeral, we need to go back to the very beginning. In Hollywood, careers can flip overnight, and Joan Rivers knew that better than anyone. One night in 1965, she walked onto The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, and by the time her 90 minutes on that stage were over, her entire life had changed. Up until then, Rivers had been hustling hard. She had slept in her car, worked temp jobs just to scrape by, and even bombed so badly on the Jack Paar show that she got banned from ever appearing again. But Carson's couch? That was the golden ticket. Her jokes hit like lightning. Her timing was razor sharp, and America saw a new kind of female comic. Unapologetic, bold, and brilliant. Carson himself turned to her on air and said the words that would define her future. "You're going to be a star." And he was right. Overnight, the bookings started pouring in. More than that, it marked the start of a 20-year relationship between Carson and Rivers. Professionally, at least, they were inseparable. By the early 1980s, Joan wasn't just a guest. She was the go-to guest host whenever Carson took a night off. She held the desk, she kept the audience laughing, and she earned her stripes as the woman who could keep The Tonight Show alive in Carson's absence. He even introduced her to her husband, Edgar Rosenberg. So when talk of Carson's eventual retirement started floating around NBC in the mid-80s, Joan naturally assumed her name would be in the running. She had, after all, put in the hours, proved she could run the ship, and had practically become part of the show's DNA. But when a list of 10 possible successors started circulating, her name was nowhere to be found. It was a gut punch. To make it worse, NBC wasn't exactly treating her like a prized player. They stalled on renewing her contract, they paid her less than what she believed she was worth, and they left her hanging at a time when she should have been securing her place in late-night history. That's when Fox swooped in with an offer Joan couldn't refuse. The Late Show starring Joan Rivers. It was groundbreaking. She would be the first woman in history to host her own late-night show. The deal was sweetened with a 5-year contract worth $15 million and a job for her husband as a producer. For Rivers, it was validation. Finally, a network was treating her like the star Carson once promised she would be. But here's where everything went sideways. Rivers' husband advised her not to tell Carson about the deal until everything was locked in. Other comedians who dared to host rival shows had been iced out of The Tonight Show instantly. If Carson cut her off and the Fox deal fell through, she would be stranded with no stage and no safety net. So, she waited. Only when the ink was dry did she pick up the phone. According to Rivers, the conversation was brief and brutal. She called Carson and told him, "Johnny, it's Joan. I think I'm leaving the show. I have my own show on Fox." With that, Carson hung up. She tried again. He hung up a second time. From that day on, Carson never spoke to her again. Carson, of course, denied it. He claimed he learnt of her new show from a press release, and a Tonight Show producer told the LA Times that Rivers never mentioned her plans, even when she appeared on Carson's show just a week before the announcement. To them, it felt like betrayal. To Joan, Carson was rewriting history. Years later, she told The Hollywood Reporter that Carson lied about never getting the call. She said she would even approach him in restaurants, trying to be cordial, and he would turn his back without a word. She believed Carson saw her not just as a colleague, but as competition. Because she was a woman, she felt he expected her to stay loyal, to never outgrow him. "I think he really felt because I was a woman that I just was his," she once reflected, "that I wouldn't leave him. I know this sounds warped, but I don't understand otherwise what was going on." When The Late Show starring Joan Rivers finally hit the airwaves, Carson's wrath made itself clear. A-list celebrities refused to appear, worried they would be blacklisted from The Tonight Show. Some affiliates didn't even air her show out of solidarity with Carson. Rivers found herself battling network politics, a divided press, and her own husband's volatile clashes with Fox executives. After just 7 months, Fox demanded that she fire Edgar. She refused. The network fired both of them instead. The fallout was devastating. Not only was her career suddenly in freefall, but also her marriage crumbled under the strain. Just 3 months later, Edgar Rosenberg died by suicide. For Rivers, it was the darkest chapter of her life. She had lost her mentor, her marriage, her show, and for a while her place in late-night comedy. But if Joan Rivers was anything, she was a survivor. In 1989, she rose again with The Joan Rivers Show, a daytime talk show that marked the start of her comeback. Although Carson never addressed the feud publicly, Rivers often did, sometimes with tears in her eyes. On her talk show in 1992, she admitted how painful it was to be erased from The Tonight Show legacy, especially when Carson's final episodes rolled around and she wasn't invited. "It gave me everything, that show," she confessed. But being left out of the farewell made her feel like her years there had been wiped away. "It hurts me so much. Carson doesn't like me. Too bad. I do like him." The feud never healed. Carson held his silence. Rivers wore her pain on her sleeve. And when Johnny Carson's funeral came in 2005, Joan Rivers, the woman once introduced to the world as his chosen star, refused to attend. Their 20-year partnership had ended in betrayal, and for her, showing up would have been nothing but a cruel reminder of a friendship turned into a wound that never closed. But in 2014, nearly 30 years after the fallout, and just months before her death, Joan finally returned to The Tonight Show. With Jimmy Fallon now hosting, the ice had thawed. They joked about her decades-long ban, and Rivers called the moment amazing. Appearing on Bloomberg afterward, she admitted it was deeply emotional. Finally, after all the rejection, she was back where it all began. It was a bittersweet full circle. Joan Rivers, the woman Johnny Carson once declared would be a star, ended her journey right back on the stage that made her one. Bob Hope. For 3 decades, Johnny Carson ruled late-night television. As host of NBC's The Tonight Show from 1962 to 1992, he wasn't just a talk show host, he was an institution. Every night, millions tuned in to see him crack jokes, tease celebrity guests, and make household names out of rising stars. Eddie Murphy, Jim Carrey, Jerry Seinfeld, Ellen DeGeneres, and Andy Kaufman. All of them had their careers supercharged by that famous stage. But behind the laughter and applause, Carson was fighting a private battle, one that simmered for years and involved one of the biggest comedy legends of all time, Bob Hope. On camera, Carson was the consummate professional. He'd flash that trademark grin, shake Hope's hand, and banter politely about whatever project the older comedian was plugging. But off camera, Carson couldn't stand having him on the show. And the more often Hope appeared, the more frustrated Carson became. To understand why, you need to know just how powerful Bob Hope was at NBC. Before Carson ever sat behind that desk, Hope was NBC. He'd been their golden boy since the 1930s, first dominating radio and then conquering television with his wildly successful comedy specials. By the time television became king in American homes, Hope was already a legend, beloved by executives, adored by audiences, and treated like royalty by the network. NBC owed Hope everything, and they made sure he knew it. Whenever Bob had a new special or movie to promote, he could appear on The Tonight Show. No questions asked, no scheduling conflicts, no pushback. For NBC, it was simple. Hope had built the network's reputation, and they were going to roll out the red carpet for him for as long as he wanted it. But for Johnny Carson, that was a nightmare. According to Bob Hope biographer Richard Zoglin, their coolness stemmed from a deep, unspoken rivalry. Carson was NBC's new king, the only star with enough clout to challenge Hope's decades-long dominance. But even at the height of Carson's fame, Hope was still treated like the untouchable elder statesman, and Johnny had to defer. Carson resented the arrangement. He hated that Hope could essentially book himself on the show whenever he pleased, which, as Carson complained privately, seemed to be all the time. And he didn't even enjoy the interviews. Hope's comedy style was rigid and scripted. He relied heavily on teams of writers and struggled to improvise or roll with spontaneous jokes, something Carson prided himself on. It made the interviews feel stale, forced, and flat. And then there was the elephant in the room: Bob Hope's declining health. As the years went on, Hope's eyesight and hearing began to fail. But that didn't stop him from showing up. Each appearance became more difficult. Hope often couldn't hear Carson's questions, forcing the host to stick religiously to the scripted cue cards. If Carson asked anything out of order, Hope would answer the wrong question entirely. What once felt like a rivalry started to feel like a burden. Hope's appearances were no longer entertaining. They were exhausting. Yet Carson had no choice but to keep smiling. NBC executives adored Hope, and even though The Tonight Show was Carson's domain, defying their wishes could have cost him dearly. The two comedy giants never had a public falling out. They never traded insults in the press or aired their grievances on stage. But the tension was undeniable. Carson saw Hope as an outdated relic who refused to step aside, and Hope treated The Tonight Show like his personal promotional platform. Bob Hope wasn't the only celebrity Carson had issues with. Wayne Newton was another famous feud. Wayne Newton. When you think of Wayne Newton, you picture the smooth-voiced Las Vegas crooner Mr. Vegas himself. And when you think of Johnny Carson, you picture the king of late night, cracking jokes behind his Tonight Show desk. Two larger-than-life stars, both adored by millions. At first, they were friendly, even supportive of each other's careers. But beneath the spotlight, that friendship fell apart. What started as showbiz camaraderie turned into one of Hollywood's ugliest, most surprising feuds, complete with insults, legal battles, mafia rumors, and even a near fist fight. Johnny Carson and Wayne Newton once came this close to throwing punches, and their fallout lasted until Carson's death in 2005. So how did two of the most polished entertainers of their era end up at war? Keep watching to find out. Wayne Newton revealed the origins of their feud in 2007 during an episode of Larry King Live. He recalled how, in the 1970s, he was a frequent guest on The Tonight Show. He sang, he charmed, and Carson seemed warm and welcoming. Newton even considered him a friend. But then, seemingly out of nowhere, everything changed. Suddenly, Newton became a nightly punchline in Carson's monologues. At first, Wayne Newton thought it was harmless teasing, but the jokes kept coming, and they weren't just about his music. Carson targeted Newton's appearance, his height, and even his masculinity. Night after night, the digs piled up until Newton wondered if he had unknowingly crossed Carson behind the scenes. He later told the Las Vegas Review-Journal that the ridicule was relentless. According to Newton, Carson not only mocked him, but encouraged other comedians to pile on as well. "He was very angry with me," Newton recalled, explaining that the jokes painted him as less than a man. There was no rhyme or reason for it. No truth, in fact, at all. Newton wasn't interested in rekindling their so-called friendship. All he wanted was for the jokes to stop. He spent a year and a half trying to reach Carson, but the host never responded. Finally, Newton decided to take matters into his own hands. He stormed into a meeting Carson was having with NBC producer Fred de Cordova, asked the producer to step outside, and confronted Carson directly. What happened next sounded less like Hollywood gossip and more like a scene out of a gangster movie. Newton looked Carson dead in the eye and said, "I don't know what friend of yours I've killed. I don't know what child of yours I've hurt. I don't know what food I've taken out of your mouth. But these jokes about me will stop, and they'll stop now, or I will kick your ass." Carson, rattled, tried to brush it off. He told Newton he was actually his biggest fan, but Newton wasn't having it. "Don't give me that," he shot back. "I am here to straighten out whatever your problem is, and whichever way you want to straighten it out is fine with me." The threat worked. Carson stopped making jokes at Newton's expense. But while the monologues ended, the bitterness between them lingered, and it only got uglier from there. Both men remained fixtures of the Las Vegas scene, and in 1980, they found themselves bidding on the same property, the Aladdin Motel. Newton won the deal, leaving Carson and his partner Ed Nigro empty-handed. That's when the feud took a darker turn. Rumors began to swirl that Wayne Newton was tied to the mafia. The rumors grew louder and louder, until Newton had no choice but to publicly deny them in the Los Angeles Times. But he wasn't buying the idea that the rumors spread organically. Newton believed Johnny Carson was behind it all. On Larry King Live, Newton didn't mince words. He accused Carson of using his power and connections to plant the mafia allegations. For Newton, the rumors were devastating. His image as a wholesome entertainer was being dragged through the mud, and he believed Carson was pulling the strings. But Newton wasn't about to let it slide. He took NBC to court, filing a libel lawsuit that became one of the most sensational of its time. The verdict? Wayne Newton won $5.2 million, the largest libel judgment ever against a news organization in Hollywood history. It looked like Newton had finally gotten the last laugh, but the victory didn't last. In 1990, a federal appeals court overturned the ruling, declaring that NBC's mafia claims hadn't been proven to be deliberately or recklessly false. Suddenly, Newton's triumph vanished, leaving him saddled with massive legal bills. The financial fallout was brutal. By 1992, Newton was forced to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, weighed down by debts tied to the lawsuit, and the hits kept coming. In 2005, the very year Johnny Carson died, Newton was ordered to pay millions more to the IRS. Still, if there was one thing Wayne Newton knew how to do, it was survive. Despite the scandals, the lawsuits, and the rumors, he rebuilt his career through his legendary Las Vegas residencies, once again becoming the city's most enduring star. As for Johnny Carson, he never publicly addressed the feud. To his audience, he was still the smooth-talking king of late night. But behind the curtain, his private war with Wayne Newton left scars that never healed. And when Carson's funeral came in 2005, Newton was nowhere to be found. After decades of barbs, lawsuits, and mafia rumors, Wayne Newton refused to show up at Johnny Carson's funeral. Tom Snyder. When Tom Snyder returned to late-night television on January 9, 1995, as the host of CBS' The Late Late Show, he didn't waste time easing in. He opened his very first broadcast with a jab aimed at one man, and that man was Johnny Carson. Why Carson? To understand, you have to go back, way back. For 8 years, Tom Snyder ran The Tomorrow Show on NBC. It wasn't The Tonight Show, not even close in prestige, but it had something rare. Snyder had a style that was raw, eccentric, and strangely magnetic. He'd lean forward, cigarette smoke curling in the studio lights, and talk like he was whispering secrets straight to your living room. Some loved him, some thought he was too much, but he stood out. He had built a loyal audience. Then came the network meddling. NBC executives couldn't leave well enough alone. They decided Snyder needed rock stars, a live audience, more noise, and more flash. And just like that, the intimacy of his show was broken. Within a few years, his seat was gone, handed to a young, untested comic named David Letterman. But Snyder's problems weren't just corporate. There was another shadow hanging over him: Johnny Carson. See, Carson ruled late night. His show was untouchable. And for reasons Snyder never quite understood, Johnny despised him. Carson didn't think Snyder had talent. He thought he was pompous, boring, and maybe even a little phony. And that dislike, it wasn't just behind closed doors. One night in 1979, the tension nearly exploded. Carson, Ed McMahon, and friends were celebrating at Chase's, a legendary Los Angeles restaurant. Across the room, Snyder was having dinner of his own. In a friendly gesture, Snyder sent over a round of drinks. Instead of thanks, it lit a fuse. Carson, already fueled by alcohol, snapped. He stormed across the restaurant, lunged across Snyder's table, and tried to grab him by the throat. The only thing that stopped it from becoming a full-on brawl was Ed McMahon, who stepped in and pulled Carson back. The night carried on elsewhere, but the damage was done. Carson wanted Snyder gone, and not long after, Snyder was. For years, Snyder drifted on the fringes of television, but fate has a funny sense of irony. By 1993, he was hosting a small talk show on cable, and one of his biggest fans was none other than David Letterman, the same man who'd once replaced him. Letterman, now king of CBS late night, had the power to decide who followed his show, and when CBS gave him control, he handed the slot to Snyder. So on January 9th, 1995, Tom Snyder walked back into late night on a national stage. And he didn't come quietly. He sat down, grinned at the camera, and opened simply, "Welcome back, everybody. I'm Tom." No last name. No need. His audience knew who he was. He spoke about the chaos of getting the show on the air, joked about the crew, and then stopped. His tone shifted. You could see he had something on his chest. Then came the moment. "In the 8.5 years that I was on the air at the other network," Snyder said, "never once did Johnny Carson say, 'And now stay tuned for Tom Snyder.' No dodging, no hints." He didn't call Carson the host of the preceding program. He said his name out loud. He called out the king of late night on Night, one of his comeback. And he didn't stop there. Snyder twisted the knife, thanking Letterman for doing what Carson never did. "What a wonderful courtesy," Snyder said, "to be plugged by the program preceding yours." It was sharp. It was bitter. It was Snyder's way of telling the world, Johnny Carson ignored me. He disrespected me. But I'm still here. That first broadcast set the tone. Snyder wasn't just back on TV. He was back on his own terms. After years of being shoved aside, mocked, and even lunged at in a restaurant, he finally had the chance to say what he'd wanted all along. And he did it live, with millions watching. So when Johnny Carson's funeral came around in 2005, Tom Snyder was nowhere to be found. The bad blood ran too deep, the humiliation too raw, and the near strangling at Chase's never forgotten. Snyder wasn't going to put on a fake show of respect for a man who had spent decades dismissing him. When people talk about Johnny Carson, the charming host who ruled late night, remember this: not everyone adored him. Not everyone bowed down. Some stood their ground. And Tom Snyder? He did it with a camera pointed straight at him, a grudge that refused to die, and ultimately by refusing to appear at Carson's final farewell. Ruth Carson. For 30 years, late-night television belonged to one man, Johnny Carson. He was the king of The Tonight Show, the quick-witted host who replaced Jack Paar in 1962 and went on to rule the airwaves until 1992. Every night, millions tuned in for his razor-sharp monologues, his flawless impressions, and his ability to make Hollywood's biggest stars feel at home on that couch. But behind the charm and laughter, Johnny Carson lived a life that was anything but picture-perfect. He was a man with demons, stories of heavy d***ing, fiery temper, and an appetite for women often made the tabloids. There was even a moment so wild, it sounds like something out of a gangster movie. Carson got tangled up with the wrong woman, and suddenly, a mob family allegedly put a hit on him. The biggest name in late night almost became a headline for all the wrong reasons. And if his love life was messy, his marriages were even messier. 4 times he walked down the aisle. 3 times he walked away with divorce papers that drained him financially. One split in 1985 alone cost him 3 houses and a brutal $35,000 a month in payments. Carson may have been a king on television, but at home, he was paying a royal price. So where did this complicated man come from? And who shaped him into the host America loved and feared? Johnny Carson himself had an answer. His mother. Born in 1925 in Corning, Iowa, Johnny grew up with Homer and Ruth Carson. And while his father was steady, his mother, Ruth, was a storm. She wanted more daughters, but only got one. With her 2 sons, Johnny and his brother, she was tough, demanding, and impossible to please. At home, Ruth ran the family like a general commanding troops. One of Carson's friends later described her as the captain of a warship. Johnny and his brother were constantly competing for her attention, but approval from Ruth was nearly impossible to win. She could be the perfect hostess when people visited, but inside the home she was strict, controlling, and often dismissive. Stories floated around about her temper, including one moment where she smashed a full set of dishes against the wall in anger. She wasn't just a presence in Johnny's life. She was a force, one he could never quite outrun. Carson's first wife, Jody Wolcott, recalled those stories of Ruth's outbursts, saying she was the real matriarch of the family, someone who dominated the household completely. For Johnny, this set the stage for everything that came later. He poured himself into performance, into being funny, into commanding attention on stage, not because he loved the spotlight, but because deep down he was always chasing something he never got at home, his mother's approval. And that void, it never closed. The relationship between Johnny and Ruth grew so strained that when she died, Carson didn't even show up to her funeral. Think about that. The biggest star in late-night television, a man who made America laugh for decades, couldn't bring himself to say goodbye to his own mother. His close friend, actor Burt Reynolds, later confirmed it. Reynolds remembered how, for as long as they knew each other, Carson never stopped complaining about Ruth. And when news of her passing came in, Carson didn't grieve. He didn't even try to hide his feelings. Reynolds recalled Carson's reaction, and it was as cold as it gets. The Wicked Witch is dead. That single line summed up years of resentment, pain, and a family bond so broken it couldn't be repaired. Reynolds even admitted that he and Carson connected over their difficult parents. Reynolds with his father, Carson with his mother. It was a kind of shared scar that shaped them both. But here's the twist in this story. Not long after Ruth's death, Carson found something she had kept hidden away. A large box, tucked out of sight. Inside, Johnny discovered it was filled with clippings, newspaper articles, stories, and mentions of his career. Every success, every achievement his mother had saved. She may have never said the words out loud. She may have never given him the approval he craved, but she had been quietly keeping track all along. Carson took that box home and, according to Reynolds, he kept it in his closet until the day he died in 2005. It was the only piece of his mother he chose to hold on to, a reminder of the complicated woman who shaped him, haunted him, and maybe, in her own silent way, admired him. Chevy Chase. Unlike today's late-night hosts, Johnny Carson wasn't about rushing guests through some scripted pre-interview. He didn't care for rehearsed anecdotes or fake setups. Sure, he'd let a guest plug their new book or movie, but Carson made it feel like a real conversation, not a commercial. He could sit with Doris Day and tease her about her virginal image while bringing up porn in the same breath. He grilled Charlton Heston about working with Cecil B. DeMille on the 10 Commandments. He laughed with Tony Curtis about fathering 6 kids with 3 different wives. And he even connected with Steve Martin over the fact that both of them had once started out as magicians. Every exchange was unscripted, unhurried, and unpredictable. a rhythm you simply don't see in late-night TV anymore. But not every guest was on Carson's good side. Take Chevy Chase, for example. Their history was rocky, and it all started back in the mid-1970s. At the height of his fame on the very first season of Saturday Night Live, Chase left the show and suddenly became the talk of Hollywood. Many believed he was destined to take Carson's throne and become the next king of The Tonight Show. When asked in an interview if he even wanted Carson's job, Chase reportedly dismissed it, saying he'd be bored sitting there every night telling jokes and interviewing dumb starlets. That jab didn't sit well with Carson, who already wasn't a fan of SNL. Carson fired back with one of the most brutal lines ever delivered in late-night history. Chevy Chase couldn't ad-lib a fart at a baked bean dinner. It took years and an apology before Carson finally let Chevy on his stage. By the time Chase appeared to promote the Three Amigos, the tension had cooled, and the two had turned their feud into an unlikely friendship. What followed was one of the most extraordinary Tonight Show segments of the 1980s. But even with that reconciliation, the scar of that feud lingered. Carson never forgot Chase's early dismissal of the job he had built into an institution. And Chase never forgot the sting of Carson's public humiliation. Which is why, when Johnny Carson's funeral came around in 2005, Chevy Chase was nowhere to be seen. The long shadow of their clash made his absence unsurprising. Another reminder that not every late-night friendship ended with a laugh. Were you ever a fan of The Johnny Carson Show? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.